Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum, designed by the MIT Mobility Initiative. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. I'm really excited to have Professor Nick Blum from Stanford join us today, talking about working from home and transport. Working from home mostly has stabilized to about a quarter of our days, but this is a five-fold increase since before COVID, right? What does it mean? Why employers choose to do that? And particularly, what's the impact on the economics and the society as a whole? So there's no better person than Professor Nick Blum, who have been really working on this and is an instrumental figure in understanding work from home and its right of impact across the society there. I actually invited Professor Blum join us 3 years ago in, I think, October 2022, talk about the future work from home, right? So 3 years on, what's happened? What's stabilized? What's new? What have we learned? So excited to have Professor Nick Blum joining us today. Before I start, I do want to warm up the audience a little bit. I invite everybody to type in the chat your organization, your city, and your local time. So I would say MIT, Cambridge, MA, 12, no. Hopefully it gives Nick a context for who the audience is. And we do have Alberto from Singapore join us at midnight there, and many others, I think, in a very inconvenient time zone. Thanks, many of to join.
Well, that's the Nick effect.
But then, yeah, I was just saying earlier before you joined, Alberto and I met as grad students. This goes back to the 90s, I think. So.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. So meanwhile, let me do a quick poll. I just launched it to just ask people, how many days do you work from home? Yeah, very simple questions. Yeah, to see is our audience mostly on par with Nick's finding on average of US, or this is a more peculiar audience. There's 130 people participate. I'll give a few more seconds.
No option for zero, Jinhua.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's my bad. Yeah. Oh, that's a design flaw. Sorry about that. Yeah, I couldn't change it now. But let me end the poll, and given the flaw, sorry, take this with a grain of thought. Sharon, 14, 21, 21, 12, 23, 9%. Yeah, sorry again, I didn't put zero there. That's a major flaw. I just rushed into it 2 minutes ago. So they can interpret it the best way you can interpret this. Thanks everyone. So stop sharing there. So let me introduce Professor Blum. Nick Blum is a William Eberly Professor of Economics at Stanford University. His work has significantly advanced our understanding of management science, productivity, uncertainty, and particularly relevant to today's talk, the dynamics of remote work. His research on the impact of remote work on productivity, especially highlighted since COVID, has influenced both the academic thinking, but also the real-world business strategy. Before Stanford, Professor Blum had worked at UK Treasury, McKinsey & Company. He is now a fellow of American Academy of Arts and Science, the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Sloan Fellowship, Fritsch Medal, and the National Science Foundation Career Award. He was elected to the Bloomberg 50 for his advice on working from home. Without further ado, let me pass the forum to Professor Blum. Nick, please.
Thanks very much. And just to say, Jinhua and I have been working for a while as well. So you're going to see some of the data that we've been involved in working together. So before I start, I'll share my slides. So I'm just going to put it into chat. Sure. As an academic, there is no IP on this. You know, you're welcome to use this. Well, I've given you the raw PowerPoint slides. So with that, why don't I go ahead and share screen? So I get rid of hide floating. Here we go. So, I mean, everyone follows the media. So you get the sense that work from home is all over if you're reading the media. So maybe the one high profile thing was back in September 2023, Zoom apparently canceled work from home, at least according to headlines. They haven't in practice. Actually, no, Eric Yuan, we talked to him quite a few times. Zoom currently, just to kind of lay the facts out there, they have engineers coming in on Monday, Wednesday, and sales on Tuesday, Thursday, but they certainly don't if you live within 50 miles, but it's true that there are fewer people fully remote. I think the much bigger announcement was Amazon. Amazon in September 2024, so now what, 6 months ago, canceled work from home and told everyone to come back to the office 5 days a week. From what I heard, that's kind of partially in effect. It's a bit mixed. And then obviously more recently, the federal government, and then in the last couple of weeks, California, state of California has announced people to come back 4 days a week. So it feels like work from home is over. What I'm going to do right now, if for the next kind of 20 minutes, and I'll go to kind of open discussion, is just what does the data show? So what do we know about the current state of working from home? A couple of quick thoughts on managing it because it relates actually to transportation, and then 4 impacts on the economy that are kind of particularly transport related. So what's the current state? So there's 3 ways I'm going to show you to measure it. The first is survey data. So in blue is our own survey, and in red is from the census. They basically both are on the same measure, which is the share of full paid days work from home. So why do I use that measure? Because it affects commuting and also actually affects office use. And on the y-axis, you can see before the pandemic, that was about 7%. So people did work from home pre-pandemic, full days, but it didn't happen very often, you know, typically once a month type of thing. During the peak of the pandemic, you can see in April 2020, work from home went up to 60% of all full paid days in the US, which is, you know, huge. More than half of full paid days in the US are actually from home. That level fell pretty quickly. The key thing to notice is from January 23 onwards, it's been very flat. So yes, it fell a lot through 2021, 22, but for the last couple of years, it's actually been relatively stable. So for example, levels of work from home in the most recent wave of sway, which surveys 8,000 Americans a month, is actually higher than it was in the January 25 is actually above January 23. Although to be clear, you know, there's some confidence intervals around this, but it's kind of flat for the last 2 years. So maybe you don't trust survey data. Another measure would be, say, swipe card data. So Castle Security are a company that do office swipes, like kind of swiping in and out for thousands of businesses across the US, and they have a nice index of how much people are returning to the office based on how many people swipe in and out. So if Genoa or, you know, Alberto or someone swipes in and out many times in a day, they become a 1, they've gone into work for the day, and if they don't turn up at all, they're a 0. They benchmark this versus February 2020. What you can see is it dropped massively at the beginning of the pandemic. So only about 15% of people were going in versus pre-pandemic. It rose and rose and rose. And then it's kind of been flattish for the last couple of years. There is some upward trend, but I would say certainly the rate of return to office has slowed down dramatically. If you look, this data goes up actually to the beginning of March. This is very, very recent data. There maybe is a bit of a tilt up at the beginning of this year. You know, it's hard to tell what's going on, but again, the evidence is not there for an enormous return to the office over the last couple of years. So again, yes, there was a big return to office and a big, you know, increase in commuting for the last 2-3 years, but it's kind of stabilized since the spring 2023. Third measure is looking at cell phones. So, you know, the nice thing about Americans, and I guess pretty much everyone, is they're never very far from their cell phone. So here is mine. It was lying on, you know, on my desk next to me. So if you can track a cell phone, you can track an individual. And this is Placer AI's information on how many people, or how many cell phones actually are going in and out on a daily basis of office buildings. And they define office buildings as buildings with at most 1 floor of retail, hotel, or anything else. These are basically primarily office locations. The level is slightly different. They index it to 0, I think is December 2019, but you can see the same trend, which is an enormous drop at the beginning of the pandemic, a big recovery, and then it's relatively flat for the last couple of years. So, you know, the top line picture for me is at least until the beginning of this year, there has not been much mobility over the last 2 years. Big question is, why does the media show otherwise? The reason fundamentally is, you know, I talk to a lot of journalists and it sells, you know, it sells newspapers. It generates clicks, comments, interest. If you have a story about the return to the office, it generates much less interest if it's a story about some companies going to remain working from home or hybrid for the next year or two. So, you know, that's the incentives that media outlets face, and as a result, that's what they produce. But if you look at the big data, the return to office has kind of stalled out about a couple of years ago. So What does it look like across countries? This is a different survey I've been involved in where we survey 34 countries. We just actually updated it for 2025. We've not quite released it, but it looks very similar to this, which is a global version of how return to the office has, been very low for the last couple of years. So this is 23 data. It looks very similar for 25. What you see that North America, as in the US, Canada, plus UK, Australia, New Zealand, have pretty high levels of work from home. This is graduates only. And in those countries, graduates, as in university graduates, are typically working from home about 1.5, maybe 2 days a week. If you look at Europe, it's a little lower. It's 1 to 1.5. If you look at Latin, kind of Central South America, it's about 1. If you go to Asia, it's more like half a day a week. So work from home across the world is definitely up, but the increase has been much higher in North America. It's been lowest in Asia. I talk to lots of multinationals, and you'll hear from folks that'll say Americans, they just are refusing to come back to the office. They won't come back. But in our Asian offices, it's almost fully full. And you see this here. Happy to come back to it in the Q&A. Oddly enough, I think Asia's the area where it makes most sense actually to see more work from home to do with congested cities, transport, and actually, fertility. It also varies hugely by industry. This is the other difference I'll point out. So finance, tech, business services, the kind of thing that, Stanford, MIT grads would end up in, the types of industries that are in New York, Boston, San Francisco are towards the top. This is why these cities tend to have relatively emptier offices, relatively more work from home. If you go down to the bottom, hospitality, food services, retail, personal services, much lower, which is why smaller cities, kind of lower income parts of the country that are more focused on those industries tend to have lower levels of work from home. So a big question is, why is it stuck? Like, why, we had this pandemic, everyone was sent home. They kind of half came back. If you look at the numbers, roughly speaking, it was 7% before, it maxed out at 60, and it's dropped down to about 25, 30%. So we've only half come back. Why is that? Well, I had a paper in Nature that came out last year, and the simple answer is hybrid is very profitable for firms. So why don't I explain what this paper shows and why it shows it's profitable for companies. So what the paper did is it took a large company called Trip.com. They are a NASDAQ listed multinational. They have about 40,000 employees. They're worth around $50 billion. And in fact, their founding CEO and now chairman, James Liang, was my student in Stanford about 15 years ago. So working with James and Robin, we ran a large randomized control trial, which took 2 divisions of Trip. And these have 1,600 people. Importantly, they're all grads. And in fact, a third are postgrads. So they're in marketing, accounting, finance, and computer engineering, as in coding. And they randomized them on an A/B test. So if you have an even birthday, so you're born on the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 8th, 10th of the month, you had to come into the office all 5 days of the week. If you have an odd birthday, like me, I'm May the 5th, so I'm on the 5th day of the month, the 1st, 3rd, 5th, etc. You got to work from home on Wednesday and Friday. So this is a classic A/B test. We just did a randomized control trial, and they held that setup for 6 months, and we collected up to 2 years of data. So what do we find? Well, there's really 2 findings in the paper. Finding 1 is there was no impact on performance. So we have performance reviews, we have 6 months, every 6 months we have promotions, we have leadership scores, innovation scores, we have lines of code written for the coders, all kinds of different measures. We just could not find any performance impact, either positive or negative. And with 1,600 people, the standard errors are pretty tight. So this is a kind of a pretty confident 0. When you interview people, the story becomes pretty clear. So interviewing, dozens of the employees and many other folks, I've spoken to easily more than 1,000 firms and managers by now. They'll say, look, coming in the office is definitely really useful for mentoring. It's much easier to mentor in person, for innovation, for building culture. So say, yes, there's definitely a big advantage of coming in the office. But by the time you've come in for 3 days a week, it is not obvious that days 4 and 5 are that helpful. The concept of kind of diminishing returns. And in particular, Tripp said, look, there are some advantages actually of working from home. One is it's quieter, so it's easier to concentrate and get deep work done. And two, you're saving a lot of time on commuting. So they said on average, we're saving about an hour and a half a day. And some of that extra time saved, they actually spend on working. And so the kind of synthesis is about 3 days a week, at least in this circumstance, was about optimal in terms of productivity. And you don't really get any more productivity for having people coming in those extra fourth and fifth days. So that's fact one. Hybrid didn't seem to have a positive or a negative impact on productivity. Fact two, the other main finding is employees certainly really liked it in surveys, and on hard data, it reduced quit rates by 35%. And why this is important is quits are very expensive for companies. So the typical numbers, for example, the Society of Human Resource Managers in the US estimates quits cost something like 50 to 100% of someone's annual salary for a grad. Trip estimated each quit cost them $30,000 to $50,000. And so the C-suite, the kind of the executive, the CEO, Jane Sun, and her board looked at this and just said, this is, obviously hybrid is obviously hugely profitable. It has no effect on productivity, but it saves us tens of millions of dollars through lower turnover. Every person that quits, you've got to go out, re-advertise, re-interview, get them in, takes 3 to 6 months to get them up to speed. It's really expensive. And this is kind of the bottom line why hybrid is stuck. 80% of Fortune 500 companies in the US are on hybrid. Why? It's not, I think, because it's a social movement or they think it's the right or wrong thing to do. It's simply because it's just more profitable. And, in a strange way, if you like hybrid, the fact that CEOs answer to shareholders is really supporting this. It just makes companies money by cutting on turnover costs. So, with that aside, you may ask, why did Amazon cancel work from home last September? They canceled it for the very same reasons on the right figure. Amazon, in the memo that Andrew Jassy put out in September 12th, last year, mentioned that Amazon had become too big. They had too many layers of management, too many employees. And so for them, they canceled work from home. They saw it as a way to, reduce headcount by 5-10% by encouraging more people to quit. So if you explicitly as a company think you have too many employees and want to reduce headcount, one way to do it, obviously, is to cancel work from home. The clear downside is you don't get to choose who leaves. It's, often the best employees that are going to leave because that's the best outside options. But, I'll stop there. I'm happy to take the Q&A, but this is why most companies are on hybrid. It's very profitable. So let's talk about how managing it. I'm not going to spend that long in it, but at least one of these two is very relevant to transit. And then finally, the last thing I'll talk about, 4 kind of geography type and labor market impacts on the economy. So a lot of people actually, if you survey Americans, in fact, if you survey globally, 20% of people say they want to come in every day. Is interesting. Jinwa's survey there, we didn't have 0 work from home days, but 20% typically of people don't want to work from home at all. They tend to be in their 20s. Kind of 50% want hybrid and 30% want fully remote. So most people want to come in at least 1 day a week. And when we ask people, this is a survey, what are the top 3 benefits of working on your employer's business premises? As in, why would you spend an hour and a half commuting in and out? Notice that the big ones are socializing with coworkers and face-to-face collaboration. So FaceTime with my managers world down there, people basically want to come in to see their colleagues and spend time with their colleagues. Given this, management practice number 1 for managing hybrid is coordination. You want people to come in on the same day. So there's just no point in Jackson on day 1, Alberto on day 2, I'm in on day 3. We come in, the office is empty, you're on Zoom with, all our co-workers. It's very irritating. We think, why didn't I work from home? What's the point to come in? So coordination is critical. This affects transport and office use because it's generating an enormous squeeze of office use into a fewer set of days. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday has become a very popular practice. You're in on those 3 days, you work from home on Monday, Friday. In fact, Friday, London Transport in the UK had it as an off-peak day for a while because there were so few people actually traveling on Fridays. So this is generating, a real peak load problem that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, for many things, I think someone from Bar here, but for many transit authorities are getting close to pre-pandemic usage, but Monday, Friday are not. And obviously with fixed costs, high fixed costs, that's a real issue for transit authorities. It's also a real issue for offices. So they're much emptier. The other so what, just while we're here on managing hybrid and remote work, is it becomes critical to have a performance evaluation. So many people I've talked to said, look, when someone's in the office, I can physically see what they're doing. I can see they're at their desk And I walk by, and are they, you know, when I look at their computer screen, are they working on Python or Excel, or, you know, maybe they're watching the Champions League or something. Basically, I can measure the input. I can see they're working. And they say, look, it's not a particularly great way of managing. It's called, you know, managing by walking around. It's like 4 out of 10, but it's possible to manage that way. They said the problem is when they're working from home, you can't actually see what they're doing. So it's very hard to evaluate them. And the big so what from this is, for managing hybrid and remote workers, you need to focus on outcomes, outputs, as in use performance management systems. So, you know, Jamar's managing me. He's not like desk watching me. He needs to basically know what I'm doing. I have a set of targets and objectives. I need to achieve them. It's better for him because he doesn't have to, you know, check that I'm online all the time, see that I respond quickly to emails or Slack or whatever. And it's actually better for me because if I want to go to the dentist or pick my kids up from school, I can do it, but then make up for it by working a bit more in the evenings. So finally, what are 4 impacts on the economy that affect transit? I go through them and you'll see they have varying effects. Some are obvious, some are somewhat more subtle. The last is kind of maybe amusing, but I'll go through them in order. So the first that's maybe the most obvious, and I put this out, I had a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences at the end of last year that points out something which we call the donut effect, which is a lot of people have left the center of big US cities and moved out to the suburbs. So this is a picture of New York. The data for this analysis comes from the United States Postal Service change of address database. It is an amazing database that by zip code, by month, tells you about the net flow of individuals. The US Postal Service actually tracks where people go, mainly because it wants to sell mailing lists to marketers. It's very lucrative for the Postal Service to sell them to people to do marketing. So if I move from here to, say, Berkeley, even if I don't tell the post office I've moved, they know I've moved because they see my mail no longer comes here and it starts going somewhere else. So we analyze this database. What you can see is a lot of people left the city centers, but they went out to the suburbs. What's driving this, it's kind of obvious. If I'm hybrid, say I work for, I know, Goliath National Bank, and I used to go in 5 days a week. I want to live in central Manhattan because it's hard to commute otherwise. Now, if I'm only going in 3 days a week, I may think, look, I can live a bit further out. I can put up with a longer commute, but you know, in return, I get a bit more space. Maybe get a home office. This movement out to the suburbs has been particularly in large American cities. So these are cities like Washington, Chicago, New York, San Francisco. Less in medium-sized cities. So think of something like Sacramento, the capital of California. It's a big city, but it's kind of 30th in the US. And we don't really see it in smaller cities. So, you know, I know Stockton, cities with kind of 100, 200,000 people, they're not big enough to really have these different areas. And so people aren't moving out. So we've seen this large outflow of individuals from big American cities, mainly to the suburbs. The outflow happened early on, and they so far have not seemed to have come back. This obviously affects many things, including commute patterns. So this is another chart from a different data set. I'll come back to it again later at the end, but it's from INRIX. So INRIX have GPS data from a large car company, and they have tens of millions of journeys every day that they can track on GPS. And what you can do is you can look at people's commuting distances, all kinds of things. What you can see is post-pandemic, there is somewhat less commuting. We know people are going in less, but the journeys they are making have actually skewed longer. So there's been a very marked increase in what we'll call super commuting, which is, you know, commutes above there's no exact definition, but here we define it above 75 miles. These are kind of 2-hour commutes. They've gone up a lot. Obviously, if people are now living further out, but only coming in 2-3 days a week, they're prepared to drive further. So it's changed the distribution, the level. People also, the morning and evening peaks are flattened out because if you're working from home, it's kind of easier to leave a bit later or, you know, come back earlier, etc. Fact 2, it's a different finding. Again, maybe not that surprising, but I'll kind of break it down. So this comes from data from Gusto. So Gusto are a payroll company. They're a competitor to ADP. And the advantage of payroll is that we know where someone lives and where somebody works, because you need to know both of those to get tax correct. Obviously, in the US, there's like state, local, city level taxes, even county taxes. So you need to have quite accurate information on people's work and home addresses in order to make sure you pay appropriate taxes. So we use the Gusto data. And what you can see is Americans are now living further from work Again, it's consistent with them moving out to the suburbs. They're living kind of 60, 70% further from work. They've gone from 16 to 27 miles away. So what's driving this? Interestingly, it's not employees that were hired before the pandemic. These folks are not moved. So it's not like that many people are moving. It's not so much about individuals moving. It's about when you hire new employees, firms are now willing to hire people living further away. So to give you an example, Stanford University, we're in Northern California. San Francisco is about 45 minutes north of us. And there's another big city, San Jose, that's about 45 minutes south of us. Before the pandemic, we would not have hired people north of San Francisco or south of San Jose because their commutes would have been an hour, easily an hour and 15. And we would have thought, look, if you hire someone and they're commuting an hour and 15 in each direction every day, they may start, but after, a month, they're going to get fed up and they're going to quit. So we wouldn't even hire them in the first place. Now, for us, employees are typically coming in 2 or 3 days a week. Many staff run that system. And so now it's perfectly reasonable to have someone commuting that far. They're only doing it 2 or 3 days a week. And so our hiring's moved out. So lots of firms are now hiring people further away. People are living out in the suburbs. It's generated just less frequent, but certainly much further commutes. If you look in the Gusto data, who's doing this? It's particularly people in their 30s and 40s. These are folks that generally have younger children, have a bit more money, so can live in a house out in the suburbs. It's also higher income people. It's also people working in finance, tech, business services. So the typical kind of 37-year-old with 2 young children living in a house out in the suburb working in finance is now commuting a lot further, but typically only coming in 3 days a week. So third fact is somewhat less related to transit, but it's kind of pretty interesting, pretty striking, is there has been an enormous increase in disability employment. So this is an incredibly good news story from the rise of work from home. So just to give you this in context, there are about 30 million Americans defined as working age with a disability. Pre-pandemic, only about 5 million of them worked. So the rest of them were not working. They're typically not looking for work. They struggle to work if you have a mobility or a vision disability, etc. So this is many millions, and it would be same in Europe, tens of millions of individuals across Asia that have a disability that aren't able to work or were not currently working. What you see is post-pandemic, a huge increase in employment of individuals with a disability. Mostly the mean age of these people is kind of early 50s. So, some of my age, I'm 51, that could have a back issue, has a disability. Pre-pandemic was not working. Now we're seeing a very sharp increase in employment. If you look at the labor market, in the discussion, we were talking a bit before we started about differences in the labor markets by gender. You do see post-pandemic that female employment has risen faster than male employment. And because these sample sizes are massive, this is a statistically significant difference. You also see some significant differences by race, certain cuts, but you can see obviously the big difference here is by disability. So Americans with a disability have seen enormous increases in employment. This is A, very good news, and B, it's heavily related to transit. At least part of the story is I've interviewed about half a dozen folks in this category now, and they'll say, look, working from home makes it much easier to work for 2 reasons. One is I don't have to commute. And actually, I interviewed someone a couple of months ago that had a car accident, a really bad car accident, and broke their neck and was now disabled from the neck downwards. They're quite senior in marketing. And they said, look, when I go into the office, it takes me 3 hours to go in. And he said, what happens is my carer has to come to my house. They have to get me up, wash me, dress me, and then take me to my car. And then my father turns up and drives me to the office. And he said, as it currently stands, I only go into work 2 days a week. When I work from home, it takes about 20 minutes because I just can stay in bed and work. And so he said, working from home saves me a huge amount of time. He also said working from home, and I hear this a lot, is also a lot easier if you have a disability because you can control your environment, the lighting, your desk, do you lie down on a bed, the toilets, etc., etc. So fact 3 is obviously, to some extent, it affects who's commuting and the modes of commuting, but we're seeing very large increase in disability employment, which I think is incredibly positive in terms of driving growth, increasing tax revenues, reducing prices. Finally, I'll talk about golf. I don't play golf. I tried to learn when I was in McKinsey years ago, but I wasn't very successful, and I've really never played since. But so many execs and managers talk to me about golf. that I collected data on this. So with Alex Finnan, we used the INRIX data again. So what we did is you can use satellite photography to identify golf courses. They're kind of easy to tell because there's lots of thin green strips. We identified about 3,500 golf courses in the US and defined a game of golf as a car trip to the golf course and you stay there for between 2 to 6 hours. So it kind of removes people going to golf courses for lunch and removes people that stay longer, presumably live next to a golf course. What you can see is before the pandemic, golf was primarily a weekend thing, some kind of Friday afternoon. During the pandemic or post-pandemic, golf has just exploded. So when I talk to people, they say golf courses are just completely rammed. You can't get around in. They're so popular. This is Wednesday. This is the middle of the, the working week when most people are supposed to be working. You notice that golf has totally exploded. This is August. So the only reason it drops in the middle of the afternoon is in the South in August. It's just too hot to play. It's just not possible to play. But you can see golf is pretty maximized. And in some ways, when I show this to people, I say, fact one is, these are many of your employees. This is why you need performance management systems. It's fine if people play golf, but you want to make sure they get their job done. So they need to, make up for it in the evening or on the weekend. Fact two is it's had a huge effect on utilization and peak loading for many leisure activities. So golf, pickleball, hair salons, shopping malls, gyms, yoga studios, dentists, etc. All of these are activities that used to have a real peak loading issue. So take gyms. They're very heavily used in the evenings between 5 and 7, some extent on the weekends, and really empty during the day. Now, because of work from home, they have much more even utilization. Again, obviously, this affects transit. Transit patterns have changed, and a lot of leisure activities like shopping malls are seeing more stable use. For example, I talked to a large retailer, a food retailer, that said pre-pandemic, their busiest day of the week was Saturday. People worked in the week and they go shopping for groceries on Saturday. They now said their busiest day of the week is Friday because so many people work from home. They've now switched. So you'll see the traffic patterns in and out reflecting this. So finally, what about the future? So to talk about the future, I'm actually going to use historic data. So Jack published his paper back in 73 here. We have some kind of patchy data on work from home all the way back to the mid 60s. This is a log scale. So the straight line tells you it's kind of growing at a pretty steady exponential rate. It was roughly doubling every 15 years. Why is that? It's just improving technology. So I'm one of 4 kids. Both my parents worked. I interviewed my mom and dad about what working from home was like in the mid 80s, because they said sometimes they were sick. They said it was terrible. As we had discussed at the beginning of the call, my mom said, look, I have to carry wads of paper home. There was only telephone calls. They're expensive. There's no internet. I didn't have a computer at home. It was really bad. In the 90s, personal computers came along. We got one at home in the mid 90s, early 2000s, the internet. And then in some ways, what's a big deal for nowadays is cloud and video calls, which have become pretty critical. So this technology is ever improving. As it improves, working from home becomes easier and easier. So using this, I predict if you look 5-10 years into the future, it's going to be higher. So we have this kind of Nike swoosh. It dropped a lot from 2020, 21, 22. It's kind of now flat 23, 24, 25, 26. In the long run, I think work from home is going to slowly start rising again just because of better technology. So living out in Silicon Valley, I've visited a lot of tech firms with amazing headsets, screens, video, cameras, etc. This stuff is coming. So to stop, I think work from home is here to stay. Fully remote is becoming quite rare, but hybrid is quite common for professionals and managers. It's typically 2 days a week at home, 3 in the office, but there's a mix. Managing it is hard. That's the big issue. You want to coordinate and you want to focus more on performance than desk watching. And it has huge impact on transit, cities, labor markets, even golf. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. This is brilliant, Nick. Yeah. So let's start with the experiment you did in trip.com, right? First of all, seems to having a student being a CEO of the company is important when you do economic research, right? But it seems you have the luxury to do that. One question I have is you're saying this benefit of working in the office, mentoring culture, kind of saturated after maybe 3 days a week or so, right? So seems that if there's a certain sense of the optimal, right? Do you think American society is like equivalent, reach the equilibrium of such optimal, or you think there's something we can still nudge it towards?
If you look, it's interesting. If you look in the data for graduate, I mean, so there's 60% of Americans can't work from home at all, just to be clear. There's a huge group, the food service, dentists, airline pilots, security, transport, they can't work from home at all. So we're only really looking now at the remaining 40%. 10% of them are actually fully remote. So they're a kind of weird group. There's a lot of people in call centers, actually, data entry, back office, payroll. If we set them aside, they're the group that I worry is some extent at risk from AI, but for now they're fully remote. The 30% is the group I want to talk about. There's kind of, in a sense, our world. It's like Stanford, MIT students, MBAs, execs. That group, I think, is going to be relatively stable at something like 3 days in the office and 2 at home. There's no exact magic number. I don't have any serious research. I mean, I don't know any hard data showing that 3-2 is better than 2-3 or 4-1 or 1-4. But roughly, it looks like some mix. There's diminishing returns to days in the office, and there's diminishing returns for days at home. So some interior solution is really where you want. Like, 1 day a week at home is really quite valuable because it's quiet. And quiet is extremely useful for reading, writing, deep work. There's a famous study in the PNAS on what's called bursting, where they get teams to do problem solve, and they randomize whether the team is all in person for 6 hours, all individual and come together at the end, or have an hour together, an hour individual, an hour together. And the third group does the best, in the sense that you kind of need some combination of thinking and then meeting up. Like as an academic, I spend sometimes reading and sometimes at home. So I think hybrid is roughly where we're at now. The area I think has the biggest upside on policy is actually Asia. And the reason for Asia, I've actually been talking to like the South Korean government, is they have very low levels of work from home. They have incredibly high levels of congestion and very small apartments, which would make life a lot easier to move out. And finally, they have incredibly low fertility rates. And if you look in the data, if you have both an individual and their spouse working from home, fertility is significantly higher. So I think the US, North America, UK kind of has it about right. Actually, I think where I see change is, Japan, China, South Korea. And actually, I wouldn't be surprised if it's government push change because of the demographics.
I see. So on the cultural differences there, right, across the globe. So first of all, it seems cannot be explained by the industry mixture here, right? Even given the industry mixture, there's still certain things there. That right, yeah, and also, but then you say, Asia often have high density, high congestion. From transportation point of view, it makes sense for people. Some people to work at home, but the reality they actually come back to office much more than the Western side, right? So do you notice, like, what's the tendency there? Oh, also, I also want to add another thing. Into e-commerce, Asia is doing a lot more e-commerce than Americans here. Right. But from working point of view, they actually go back to office. Any theory or hypothesis on this?
I quite often talk to James, and so James Liang is the chairman and Jane Sun is the CEO of Trip. They had a fascinating comment. So I don't know if any American managers are listening here. It's amazing. So they said, look, for the American parts of the operation and for American managers, typically you're fighting to get people back in. So the media here is all full of like, I was actually talking to a company a couple of weeks ago that tracks, they're called Worklytics. They track very closely how many days people come into the office. And they said, typically, if a company mandates you in 3, you're seeing on average 1.5 to 2. So these return to office mandates are almost always never met. Mostly people are coming in 50 to 70%. And secondly, they said they tend to come in a lot when the new mandate comes out because everyone's focusing on it. And then after 6 months, they get distracted. So normally it's below. James and Jane were saying in Trip.com in Shanghai and in Asia is often above. And what's happening there is employees are very nervous about the labor market, and they think if they come in extra days, they're safe. But the Asian tendency is if you're asked to come in 3 is to come in 3.5. The American tendency, if you're asked to come in 3, seems to be to come in 2.
I see. It's more of a labor market competition pressure that.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, there's some cultural issues. It's kind of interesting. They have the same mandates, but they said the US and the Asian, but the actual realizations are very different.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Yeah. Another question is about the coordination, right? You mentioned that if you want people to come back home, you better come home at the same time, right? But then you give an example of Zoom. When they asked people to come home, they said, I couldn't remember exactly, technology people come Monday, Wednesday, sales, some people come Tuesday and a Thursday. So that means who to coordinate with. That's kind of a lot of design thinking on this, right? So is it within the team, cross the team, different department, what type of people we should bring to coordinate?
Exactly right. So it's a really quite a complicated problem. So just as backdrop, I've talked to a lot of kind of C-suites, and often that person in charge of real estate is feeling really stressed because the CEO is saying, I notice we're only coming in 60% of days, so we've reduced footfall by 40%, but office space is unchanged. And often what will happen is a battle. So there's kind of model A, which everyone comes in on the same day. So everyone comes in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You can't cut office space at all. All that's happening now, you just have empty offices on Monday, Friday. And you think, well, it's a total waste. But the critical thing for the business is people come in on the same day. They're coordinating. There's this, randomized meeting and mentoring, etc. That is, I'd say, the most common view of most organizations. Then there's version B. So when I talked to Eric about Zoom, he said, we just grown a lot and we no longer have office space. He said, it's just not possible to get everyone in. And he said, we could buy more office space. But for us, for the business, given that sales doesn't overlap that much with engineering all comes in on Monday, Wednesday, and sales all comes in on Tuesday, Thursday. And he said, the downside is obviously you have a town hall or a big all hands meeting. They can't all be there and you have to organize it in advance. But otherwise it's more efficient on space. So I think it depends critically on the organization. Like in universities, I'm in economics, I don't overlap particularly with English. So we don't also share space, but we could certainly share teaching rooms, which you do. And, it's MIT, people using lecture. So it depends very much on the setup. But I would say the typical company takes the view that it's better to have people in on the same day. So normally they're coordinating, so they get people together. That's the good side, but they're not efficiently using office space.
But here also there's a difference between this designed interaction versus a spontaneous one, right? But seems here, in order for this half coordination to happen, you destroy some of the spontaneity. So some will come from the more intentional design.
The spontaneity means that you've got to be in there on the same days. So I think the critical thing is the policy highlights which days you come in. And to highlight even more why it's critical, there's what I call a kind of a public good or a negative effect if one person stay home. So imagine there's 8 of us in a team and I stay home and all 7 other people come in on the Wednesday. You now have a team meeting. You're like, oh, Nick's at home. Oh, we got to get on Zoom. Oh, we better go to this conference room with Zoom. We all get in the room. There's a big screen. We're looking at it's really annoying. And so it's not just that, I want to be into Jamal. If I go to get a coffee, you're there and we chat to each other. There's also for every team meeting can happen in person. We can close laptops sometimes and talk, etc. So that definitely requires coordination. My view on the best way to do this is actually pick a reasonable number of days and then probably actually enforce it. So there's an old Roman saying about a good law is an enforceable law. If you say pick 3 days in the office, that seems reasonable, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, then properly enforce it. If you pick 5, there's an organization I won't mention that picks 5, doesn't enforce it. When I talked to them, they said it's a mess. Some people on Monday, some on Tuesday, it's a whole. They said whenever you come in, only half the people are there, and people are hiding and coffee badging. Whereas organizations that say, like I said at the IMF, and the IMF say basically you got to come in Tuesday, Thursday, and they enforce it, and people do. So when they come in on Tuesday, Thursday, everyone's there and they're kind of happy and it's lively. And when you're at home on Monday, Friday, you're relaxed, it's your home days, and Wednesday is a bit of a mix.
Yeah. So it seems to set a kind of a moderate, realistic goal, but I'm serious about that goal, right?
Exactly. Any parents getting their kids to bed is like that, It's the same thing.
Yeah. And then also the golf effect is so interesting. So it seems that this is really beneficial for the small business, this retailing, whatever business have this huge peak hour issue here, right? This kind of spread out much better to organize the resources. Do you see this as some productivity gain or any performance of those businesses?
So great question. So the peak thing is some industries are helped and some are hindered. So on one hand, there's transport, and offices that are really hit negatively by the peak effect. So offices are now used for less days, transport used for less days. So if you were to measure productivity of those industries, they'd look worse because the capital's the same. Like you can't get rid of the rail lines on the Monday, Friday, but the throughput is lower. So certain things have been really negatively affected. On the other hand, if you look at a lot of leisure and services like golf gyms, they look much more productive because you're getting more throughput for the same amount of capital. And just, you see this in accounts. So take gyms. If you take, Equinox almost went bankrupt in the summer of 2020. So they run a bunch of gyms. And like, I remember thinking back then, who would ever invest in a gym ever again? It's like, who wants to be in an indoor sweaty area with a global pandemic? I'd never go there ever again in my life. But now 5 years later, they're booming because now they can sell more gym memberships for a given gym because some people are going to use it in the day. So if you can sell it to people that work from home, they don't particularly want to go between 5 and 8 p.m. They want to go during the day. And so they're, getting 130% of pre-pandemic revenue from the same amount of space. Golf courses, right. Golf is now incredibly profitable compared to pre-pandemic. So yes, it's like a twist. It's twisted the economy and affected some things positively and some negatively.
Right. Maybe two questions from me and then give it to John for the audience question. The first one is just clarification. There are two things. One is the commuting distance increased, right? But then the distance between home and office doubled, right? The two are different things, right? We're not talking about actual commuting distance doubled. We're saying the distance between home and work, whether you commute or not, that doubled, right? Is that, I just to clarify that.
Yeah. It's a good question of what's happened to total miles driven, because in the short run, there's almost certainly down because people didn't immediately move location. But in the long run, if we're looking at 5, 10, 15 years, it could easily be up. It depends on the elasticity. So right. People now drive less, but they drive further. So I don't have the data, maybe someone else. We just noticed that the thing I showed you on commuting distance, it was shares of journeys rather than total counts. But the distribution of journeys has gone longer, but I think there's less of them.
I see. Yeah.
Last question. Spread out, by the way. The other thing is that the commutes are less compressed. One of the reasons you hear is even if it's my office day, my boss is more relaxed about me coming in 2 hours late, saying I'm working from home in the morning to take a call with the London office, because they know that I work from home on Monday, Friday. So they're like, fine, on a Thursday, speak to the London office at 7 a.m. Pacific time and come in later. And so we see commute times are spread out, which is good. I mean, it reduces peak.
Yeah. Right. So last question is more about the whole learning process, right? You've done a lot of research even before COVID, right, on work from home. But COVID itself is the largest scale mandatory social experiment, right? So what you learned, you only learned it because of COVID experiment that you didn't know before COVID. And also during that, 3 years ago, you made some predictions. 3 years out now, which part of prediction you think, oh, I got it right? And what are the surprises that you didn't get it right?
I think compared to the typical person, I was more optimistic that working from home would stick. But on the surprise, I didn't think it would stick as much as it has. Actually, I've been amazed how permanent it is. So what happened really, if you look at, we were collecting data each month, that you've been involved in as well, this Sway survey, we're surveying each month. We're asking businesses, how much do you think this will last? And if you look in 2020, most of them said it's not. They said it's just temporary. Once the pandemic's over, you're going to have to come back. And then two things happened. One is the pandemic just lasted for a lot longer than anyone thought. So the lockdowns are rolling into 21 and some into 22. And then secondly, there was an enormous boom in the labor market in 21 and 22, and it became really hard to hire people. And work from home is seen as a critical perk. So those two kind of extended it out until 23, 24. And at that point, it just kind of has stuck as a new equilibrium. So I think what I've learned is it's a kind of multiple equilibrium, but we are now in a new equilibrium whereby work from home and hybrid has become the norm. When you talk to lots of firms like law firms, consulting firms, they'll often say things like, well, our clients are working from home. So I've had this to a lot of people that are in sales industry. I was talking to a firm that does Trinet. They do a lot of kind of outsourced HR, and they're saying a lot of the people they're trying to talk to are at home too. So it makes sense for their sales agents to be at home on Monday, Friday. So the whole thing shifted across, and I think it's now permanent. It looks like it's, it hasn't changed now. We're 5 years on. I don't see it ever going back. And in fact, in the 5-10 years future, I see it being higher because of better technology.
Great. Thank you so much. Now I'll give John for the Q&A from audience. John, please.
Nick, as you could expect, for something that affects all of us so directly, so personally, for the 300 plus people that joined this session of the Mobility Forum. Lots of great questions, lots of great comments. So I'm going to try to just fly very quickly. If you could try to sort of limit your response, because there's really good questions in here. All right, so question number one from Sally Chen, very early on. She said, if I heard correctly, the travel time saved by not commuting is then spent on working. Does that mean people are willing to work more? So
Great
is it
question.
a
So
trade-off?
it's hard to be totally sure, but on surveys, we ask people, what do they spend the roughly hour, 20 minutes they save? Mostly it's travel. There's actually 10 minutes saved on less grooming. So scary details, but people brush their teeth less. They use deodorant, shower less when they work from home. Whether you think that's good or bad, they save about 120 minutes. Sorry, an hour, 20 minutes. They report they spend 40% of it more working on their primary or secondary job and 60% on chores, childcare, and leisure. So not surprisingly, every margin improves. But if you're suddenly given an extra hour and 20 minutes each day, you reallocate some of it, and some of that goes. So for employers, I'm like, your employee can work more. I mean, and the leisure bit includes rest, sleep. So they're also more rested.
Right. Okay. Melissa Galgan had a question. How do you deal with the fact that many employers do not have enough desks for everyone to come in on the same day? For example, my employer has 300 employees and 100 desks. It's been explicitly listed as a cost saving, but it undercuts the idea that we are coming into the office to build culture, see people. I'm sure you've seen this pop up a lot. How are employers in general managing through this office space versus peak? How are they managing that?
It's a great question. I mean, it's hard to deal with that. Generally, coming back to Jinro's question earlier, I would try and, if I was the CEO or CHRO, I would try and figure out which groups are most valuable to come in together. And then like Zoom, maybe, look, if there are 3 groupings, I maybe have one grouping Monday, Tuesday, another Tuesday, Wednesday. You try and split it up. People generally don't like having to come in on Friday, but if you really have 3 times as many employees as desks, you're probably going to have to use Friday as well. There are definitely trade-offs. So that's the downside. At this point, I don't know, you've all seen the news that Amazon's having this problem. They don't have enough parking either. So, people are being asked to come. I was actually talking to 2 people yesterday who work with Amazon folks, and they're saying it's a real mess. They're trying to have meetings. There's no meeting rooms. So I don't know whether, this was bad planning or this was the intention, but yes, that is an issue with people coming in.
Right, right. And as you pointed out, this concentrated peak of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday hurts transit, hurts office availability.
You need to plan deliberately. It won't work if you say let people come in 2 days and choose it, because everyone's going to come in, and you don't. You have to say, Team A, you guys are. All of the people in the Americas sales group have to come in Monday, Tuesday. All the people in engineering have to come in Wednesday, Thursday, for example.
Okay. Anthony Townsend had a question about, have you seen any differences between privately held companies and other types of companies? So have you sort of explored the typology of companies?
A little bit, in the sense that there's a big study looking at the Russell 3000 largest publicly listed companies, looking at why they make return to office announcements. And basically, I won't go through it, but one of the stylized facts is if your CEO is older, male, and powerful, defined as holds a lot of equity or very highly paid, they're more likely to call return to office. So in private companies, that outcome, I suspect, is more likely. So if you think of a 600-person company that Mr. or Mrs., particularly Mr. X, has founded and is now in his 60s, they're likely to think, the mindset is, I did well, I made it big being in the office 5 days a week, so you guys better come in. It turns out that these return to office announcements don't have any net effect on performance. They're not better, they're not worse, and they don't affect stock price in publicly listed companies. But I think smaller private companies, particularly run by an older male, powerful CEO, are more likely just to have 4 or 5 day RTOs.
Interesting. A question from Brian Taylor, comment followed by a question. Have you analyzed hybrid work days? So we have done research showing that the peak of the afternoon peak traffic has shifted from 5 to 6 p.m. to 3 to 4 p.m., with primary and secondary school proximity significantly associated with this shift. It would appear that many parents are working 6-hour days to match the school day. driving their kids to or from school, and presumably working from home in the late afternoon. Any thoughts on that?
Great. I'd love to see the study. And yeah, I totally look. My youngest is in fourth grade, so I completely can see that. In fact, Microsoft put something out. I was talking about it yesterday on the triple peak. That if you look at activity data, say logins or network access, normally what you'll see is it starts rising at 8 a.m., kind of peaks at about 11, drops for lunch, and has another afternoon peak and drops off. In the pandemic and post-pandemic, you saw a third peak from about 7 or 8 p.m. So people are clearly working morning and afternoon, but they're then relogging in the evening. So I'm fine with that. I also think it's not necessarily bad. It was positioned as this is terrible. People are having to work in the evenings. If you have kids and you want to pick them up from school and make up for it in the evening, I do that. I think that's fine. I think as long as it's a choice. It's problematic if your tyrannical boss is logging in at 8, 9, 10 p.m. and is forcing you to. But if you're doing it out of choice, I think it's fine.
Kara Kokelman at UT Austin, also one of our senior fellows, asked if someone can point her to articles where it says universities do better with faculty and students at home. I don't think it works for us, but allowing those who really benefit from working from home to do that several days a week makes sense. Let's bring this to a broader question about education and, working sort of the whole COVID culture and working from home and being educated at home. Do you now reflecting think that, there's a sort of a realization perhaps that some of the school programs were extended for students to stay at home for longer than they should have? Or do you just have any thoughts or reflections on the world of education, recognizing it's very different if we're talking about primary school versus university education? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, my views on this are more anecdotal and personal experience as a parent with kids in school and also teaching. Yeah. My experience and what I've seen my own kids is in person is a lot more effective. So there's a lockdown, there's a big debate about whether it went on too long or not, but at least for Stanford and my own kids, they're all fully back. The one change that I've seen that I think is net positive is at Stanford, many lectures are now recorded. So students that miss it can watch it later. That has emptied lecture halls a bit. And I'm not sure that it's good or bad. It's a bit like the personal trainer effect. There's some benefit of getting students into the lecture hall for an hour and a half because they're kind of forced to pay attention. It's not obvious. I know this, my two oldest kids are undergrads and they mean to watch the lectures later on Zoom, and it's less obvious whether they actually do. But me personally, I've moved entirely to teaching in person. All our research center, I was at Berkeley yesterday for a research talk there, and that was completely in person. So I'm on hybrid. I'm at home right now, and like things like this, and when I read and write papers and deal with data is much better at home because it's quieter. But for teaching, and I'll go in for lunch today because I have a meeting with my PhD students. So I'm like I think teaching is probably best in person, at least my experience. I don't have hard data on it, but that will be my strong prior on what I've seen and what I've heard from colleagues and from my kids.
Nick, we're going to share this chat file with you because, again, lots of great comments, lots of great questions.
Thanks so much. If anyone, please connect up on LinkedIn if you have any questions. Like many people, I've kind of moved off Twitter, but I'm now on LinkedIn. So yeah, please, and on Blue Sky, but I generally use LinkedIn. So please connect up on that. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So Nick run this work from home survey continuously and open source the data. That's a major contribution to the research community. Thank Nick for doing that as well. So everybody, this is a fantastic discussion and presentation. Please join me. Thank Professor Nick Blum for the discussion. Bye.